contemptuous behavior has put civilians and humanitarian personnel at risk, purposefully placing them in the crossfire. The use of civilians and civilian objects to shield or impede military operations is a violation of international humanitarian law, which all parties to armed conflict must comply with. Mr. President, I join others in expressing sincere condolences for the humanitarian workers who lost their lives in this conflict. Every death, including those of UN and humanitarian workers that many have discussed today, would have been avoided had Hamas accepted the bridge proposal on the table last month. Moreover, the IDF has reported with respect to the incident on March 23rd that uncoordinated vehicles were identified advancing toward IDF troops without headlights or emergency signals. Additionally, the IDF has indicated that earlier that day vehicles passed safely on the route after they were coordinated with the IDF. The IDF and COGAT established a deconfliction mechanism, and it is important that all actors use this mechanism to help ensure the safety of civilians and humanitarian workers. Mr. President, Hamas's reckless decisions have caused enough bloodshed. They have no right to represent Palestinians anywhere and must leave Gaza. All of this violence could stop today if Hamas returned the hostages and the bodies it still holds and laid down its weapons. There is one entity that could stop violence for everyone in a moment, and that is Hamas. The Council should speak with one voice to apply pressure on Hamas to, for the first time, act in the interests of the Palestinian people they purport to represent, and not in the interests of their own selfish ends. We must recognize the bravery of Palestinian civilians in Gaza protesting against Hamas's despotic rule, calling for Hamas to release the remaining hostages, step down and leave Gaza forever. This flood of life movement reflects the civilian population's rejection of Hamas. This Council's efforts should focus on applying pressure to dislodge Hamas, who responded to these organic challenges to its rule the only way it knows how, by murdering 22-year-old Palestinian Odeh Nasser al-Arbai and disposing of his body at his family's home. We must heed Palestinian voices that reflect Hamas's failures and deadly rule over Palestinians in Gaza. And our partners in the region must amplify these voices too, and remove Hamas from Gaza once and for all. As it relates to the West Bank, the United States supports the efforts of the Israel Defense Forces to root out violent extremists in Jenin and Tulkarm. We call on the Palestinian Authority to finally carry through on its announcement to end the practice of offering cash payments to the families of those who have carried out terrorist attacks, which for far too long incentivized violence against Israeli civilians and set back the prospects of peace. We will be closely monitoring implementation of these recent commitments. Colleagues, it has been nearly 18 months since Hamas started this horrific conflict, one that has upended so many lives and caused so much immense suffering. Hamas must release the remaining 59 hostages, including 5 Americans, New Jersey resident Don Alexander, and the bodies of Itai Shen, Gad Haggai, Judy Weinstein-Haggai, and Omer Nutra, who were brutally murdered on October 7, 2023. President Trump has been clear that Hamas must release all remaining hostages immediately. As we have repeatedly said, the future of the Middle East must also look different. Fresh thinking is needed for a better tomorrow for Israelis, Palestinians, and all the region's people. We look forward to continued discussions with our Arab partners on the future of Gaza without Hamas. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame la
I thank
représentante
the
des États-Unis. Je
representative of
donne
the
la
United
parole à
States.
Monsieur
I
le
give the
représentant
floor
de la
to the
Fédération russe.
representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Отмечаем выступление
We
Верховного
note the
комиссара
statement
ООН
of the
по
UN
правам
High
человека
Commissioner for
Волкова
Human
Турка.
Rights, Volker Turk.
Благодарим президента
We thank the President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Yunus Al-Khatib,
за обстоятельные
for
доклады
his
по
thorough
ситуации в зоне
briefing
Палестино-израильского
on
конфликта.
the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli
Признательны
conflict
также
zone, and we are
господину
also
Аль-Хатибу
grateful to
за
Mr.
дополнительные
Al-Khatib
брифинги и
for his
встречи
additional
с
briefings
делегациями
and meetings
в ходе
with
его пребывания в
delegations
Нью-Йорке,
during his time in New
что
York.
позволило нам
This allowed
получить
us
последние
to
данные о
get the
ситуации
latest
на
information
оккупированной
about the
палестинской
situation
территории.
on the occupied Palestinian territory.
Мы сразу же поддержали запрос
Right away,
Алжира
we
на
supported the
сегодняшнее
request of
заседание
Algeria
Совета,
for today's council
поскольку
meeting,
положение на
since the
оккупированной
situation
палестинской
on the
территории
occupied Palestinian
в секторе Газа
territory
и
in
на
the Gaza
западном
Strip
берегу
and the
реки
West
Иордан
Bank
остается на
remains
недопустимо критическом уровне.
unacceptably critical.
После срыва договоренности
After the
между
breakdown in
Хамас
the
и
agreement
Израилем,
between Hamas
уже
and
более месяца
Israel,
мирные
for more
палестинцы
than a
находятся
month
в
now,
условиях
Palestinian
полной
civilians
наземной,
have been
воздушной и
in the
морской
conditions
блокады.
of a full ground, air, and maritime blockade.
Западный Иерусалим не
West
только
Jerusalem is
заблокировал
not
поставки
only
гуманитарных
blocking
грузов,
the delivery of
но и
humanitarian goods,
ограничил
but has
работу
also
гуманитарных
restricted the work of
организаций ООН,
the humanitarian
что привело
organizations
к
of the UN,
экзистенциальным
which led
проблемам
to
для 2
existential
миллионов
problems
человек.
for 2 million people.
Простой пример.
A simple
Все пекарни
example is
анклава
that all of
прекратили
the bakeries in the
работу из-за
enclave have
нехватки муки и
closed due
топлива.
to a shortage of flour and fuel.
Как отсутствие хлеба в Газе
How the lack of
поможет
bread in
Израилю
Gaza is
освободить
going to help Israel
заложников,
release the
которые при этом его
hostages
также не
who
получат,
also aren't getting that
для нас
flour,
большая загадка.
is a mystery for us.
Наряду с гуманитарной
Alongside the
катастрофой
humanitarian
мы видим
catastrophe, we are
продолжающееся
seeing
уничтожение
the ongoing
гражданской
destruction
инфраструктуры
of
и
civilian
гибель
infrastructure
гуманитарных
and the
работников.
deaths of humanitarian workers.
С октября 2023
Since October
года в Газе
2023,
погибли не
in
менее
Gaza, at
408
least
сотрудников
408
гуманитарных
staff of
организаций,
humanitarian organizations
что
have died.
делает этот конфликт
That makes this
самым
conflict the
смертоносным
most
по
lethal
данному
by this
показателю за всю
measure
историю
since
наблюдений.
records began.
Надежды на изменение ситуации к
Hope
лучшему почти
for the
нет.
situation changing for the
Ведь
better
удары
is almost
Израиля по
non-existent
сектору
because
осуществляются
Israel
почти
strikes
без
on the
остановки.
Gaza Strip are carrying out on
2
an almost
апреля
constant
в 10
basis.
утра
On the 2nd of April at 10
военно-воздушные силы
a.m., the Israeli Air
нанесли удар
Force
по
launched a
медицинскому центру
strike
Бапор
on
в
the
Джабалии.
UNRWA medical center in Jabalia.
Хотя объект уже не
Although that
использовался в
object
медицинских
was no
целях,
longer being used for
он
medical
служил
purposes,
убежищем
it
для
was
более
serving as a
700
shelter
человек.
for more than 700
По
people.
поступающей информации, в
According to
результате этой
reports,
новой
as a result of
бесчеловечной
this
израильской
latest
атаки погибли
inhumane
десятки
Israeli
мирных
attack,
жителей, включая
dozens of
ребенка,
civilians
которому
died,
едва
including a
исполнилось 2 недели.
child that was barely 2 weeks old.
Несмотря на предупреждения
Despite the
сотрудников
warnings
БАПОР
of
о
UNRWA
рисках
staff members
нахождения в
about the
здании
risks
после
of staying
атаки,
in the building after the
многие
attack,
перемещенные семьи
many of the
остались там,
displaced families
потому что
stayed
им
there
просто некуда больше
because
идти.
they simply had nowhere else to go.
Только за один сегодняшний
Today
день в
alone,
результате неизбирательных
as a
израильских
result of
авиаударов по всему
indiscriminate
сектору
Israeli
было
airstrikes
убито по
across the
меньшей
Gaza
мере 100
Strip,
человек.
at least 100 people have been killed.
Бомбардировкам подвергли
Bombs
жилые
have been
дома,
dropped on
школы,
residential buildings,
использовавшиеся в
schools
качестве
that were being
убежища,
used as
палатные городки.
shelters and tent cities.
Очевидцы сообщают, что в
Witnesses
городе Газа,
report
где
that in
погибли
Gaza
58
City, where
человек,
58 people
местным
died,
жителям в отсутствие
local
какой-либо
residents, in the
спасательной
absence
техники,
of any rescue
приходится голыми
equipment,
руками
had
разбирать
to
завалы
clear the rubble
в
with their
надежде
bare hands
обнаружить
in the
чудом
hope
уцелевших.
of, by some miracle, finding survivors.
Выражаем наши
We
искренние
express our
соболезнования
sincere
всем
condolences
погибшим,
to all of those
желаем
that have been
скорейшего
killed, and we
выздоровления.
wish a swift recovery to those affected.
Подчеркиваем, что под
We
удары
underscore
попадают в том числе и так
that it is
называемые
also
зоны
the so-called
безопасности,
security zones that
установленные
are
самими
being
же
hit,
израильтянами.
those zones that were established by the Israelis
Такое откровенное
themselves.
пренебрежение
Such
нормами
blatant
международного
disregard for the
гуманитарного
norms of
права
international
требует
humanitarian
самого
law
решительного осуждения.
deserves to be roundly
В
condemned.
целом, с начала войны более 300
In total, since the
воинских
beginning of the
объектов
war, more than
подверглись атакам,
300 UN
некоторые
objects have
неоднократно.
been attacked, and some of them repeatedly so.
Господин председатель,
Mr.
нас
President,
шокировали
we were
известия об
shocked by the
обнаружении
news
31
of the
марта
discovery on the
массового захоронения,
31st
в
of
котором
March of a
были
mass
погребены
grave
15
in which 15
домработников,
humanitarian workers were buried, including UN staff and 8 medics from the Palestine Red Crescent Society.
Представители УКГВ уже
Representatives
возложили
of
ответственность
OCHA
за
have
это
already placed
преступление на Израиль.
responsibility for this crime on
По
Israel.
данным ООНовцев, после того,
According
как
to
первая
UN
группа медиков
data,
и
after the first
домработников
group of
пропала без
medics
вести
and
23
humanitarian workers
марта,
went missing on the 23rd of
израильтяне
March,
методично
the
устраняли
Israelis
всех, кто
methodically
пытался
took
пойти на
out
помощь их
all of those
товарищам.
that tried to come to the aid of their
При
comrades.
этом
And
автомобили
yet,
скорой
the
помощи были четко
ambulances were
маркированы,
clearly marked,
как и форменная одежда врачей.
as were the doctors' uniforms.
Такие действия не могут
These sorts of
иметь никаких
actions
оправданий.
can have no justification.
В контексте обсуждения
In the
данного
context
конкретного
of the discussion of
сюжета
this specific
призываем все стороны
subject, we
предпринять
call upon
максимум
all
усилий для
parties to make
поиска
every
одного из
effort
членов
to find
команды
the
палестинского
one
Красного
member
полумесяца,
of the
который
Palestine Red
по-прежнему
Crescent
числится
team
пропавшим
that is
без
still
вести.
listed as missing,
Асада Аль-Насасра.
Assad al-Nasasra.
Его тело не было
His
найдено среди
body was
погибших.
not found among the dead.
Защита гуманитарного
The
персонала,
protection of
который
humanitarian
буквально вчера
personnel,
Совет
which
подробно обсуждал
the
в этом
Council
зале,
discussed in detail in this
безусловный
chamber literally
императив и
yesterday, is
обязательство
an
в соответствии с
unconditional
нормами
imperative
международного
and
гуманитарного права.
obligation in accordance with the norms of international humanitarian law.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
выдвинув по завершении первого
having,
этапа
following
соглашения
the
с
end of the
ХАМАС
first phase of the
новые
agreement
требования
with Hamas, made further demands
дальнейшей реализации этой
for the further
договоренности,
implementation of the
Израиль
agreement,
возобновил свою
Israel
военную операцию
resumed its military
и
operation
постепенно расширяет
and is
контроль за
gradually
сектором
expanding
Газа.
its control over Gaza.
1 апреля
On the
премьер-министр
1st of
Нетаньяху
April, Prime Minister
объявил о создании
Netanyahu announced the creation of a second Philadelphia corridor, the Morag axis, that would cut Rafah off from Khan Yunis.
В этом же ряду следует рассматривать
We should also,
изъявление
in the
министра
same
обороны
vein,
Израиля
consider the
Исраэля
statement of the
Катца
Minister of
о
Defense of
расширении
Israel, Israel
района операции
Katz,
в
about the
Анклаве
expansion of
и
military
создании
operations in the
дополнительной
enclave
зоны
and the
безопасности.
creation of additional security zones.
Таким образом, территория, на
Thus,
которой
the
приходится
territory
ютиться
upon
газетянам,
which Gazans
планомерно
have to
сужается.
huddle is steadily
Это
shrinking.
ставит их перед вынужденным
And this
выбором
forces them to make a
оставаться в Газе
choice,
без
to
воды,
remain in Gaza without
электричества
water,
и достаточного
electricity, or
пропитания,
sufficient
в надежде на то,
sustenance,
что израильская
in the
операция
hope that the
когда-нибудь
Israeli
прекратится,
operation will
и они
at some
не
point
станут
end,
жертвами
and that they will
очередного
not become the
авиаудара,
victims of another airstrike,
либо покинуть
or
сектор.
to leave the Gaza Strip.
Конечно, в этих
Of
условиях
course,
никакой
in these
добровольной
circumstances,
иммиграции
there
или
can be
эвакуации
no
речи быть не может.
discussion of evacuation or voluntary
Подтверждаем нашу
immigration.
принципиальную
We
позицию о
confirm our position of
недопустимости
principle
территориальных
that it is
или
unacceptable for there to be
демографических
territorial
изменений
and
в Газе,
demographic
которая
changes
была и
in
остается
Gaza,
неотъемлемой
which
частью
was and
палестинского
remains an
государства.
integral part of the Palestinian state.
В контексте
In the
катастрофической
context
гуманитарной
of the
ситуации в секторе
catastrophic
Газа,
humanitarian
особенно в
situation in the
условиях
Gaza
введенной со
Strip,
2 марта
particularly
полной блокады,
under the full blockade
растущая
introduced
озабоченность
since the
вызывает
2nd of March, we are
поступающие из разных
increasingly concerned
источников
by
сигналы о
signals from
планах Израиля
various
в
sources
перспективе
about
установить
Israel's
полный
plans
контроль
in
над
future
доставкой и
to establish
распределением
full
помощи в
control
анклаве.
over the supply and distribution of assistance to the enclave.
Надеемся, что Западный Иерусалим
We hope
все-таки не
that West
пойдет на эти
Jerusalem
меры,
will not
которые
take these
противоречили
steps
бы
which would
докладам Совета
contradict the reports to
Безопасности
the
старшего
Security Council
координатора ООН по
by the
оказанию
UN Senior
гуманитарной помощи
Coordinator
и
for the provision of
восстановлению сектора
humanitarian
Газа
assistance and
Сигрид
reconstruction
Хаг
of the Gaza Strip,
о
Sigrid Kaag,
функционировании
about the
согласованного с
functioning
Израилем
of
механизма единого
the
окна,
one-stop shop mechanism
который
agreed with
мы все
Israel,
поддержали.
which we all supported.
Также подтверждаем нашу
We
твердую
also
поддержку
confirm our
БАКО,
firm support for
играющего
UNRWA,
незаменимую роль
which
в
plays
оказании
an
помощи
irreplaceable
палестинцам.
role in providing
Опыт
assistance
агентства,
to the
разветвленная
Palestinians.
система
The
оказания
agency's
гумсодействия и
experience, its
созданная за
extensive system of
десятилетия
humanitarian
инфраструктура крайне
assistance,
востребована в
and the
нынешней
infrastructure built up over
критической
decades
ситуации в
is
анклаве.
vital in the current critical situation
Призываем
in the
израильские
enclave.
власти
We call
пересмотреть
upon the Israeli authorities to
дискриминационные
revise
и
the
запретительные
discriminatory
решения
and
в отношении
prohibitive
БАКО,
decisions relating to
вернуться к
UNRWA
соблюдению
and to
соответствующих
return to
международных правовых
compliance with
обязательств.
its international legal obligations.
Господин председатель, тревожная
Mr.
ситуация
President,
складывается и
a
на
worrying
западном
situation
берегу
is
реки
also
Иордан.
forming on the West Bank.
Расширяется израильская операция «Железная стена».
The Israeli
В
Operation
одном только
Iron Wall is
Дженине было
expanding.
убито
In
34
Jenin alone,
человека,
34
десятки
people have
получили
been killed
ранения.
and dozens were
21
wounded.
тысяча человек стали
21,000
внутренними
people have
перемещенными
become
лицами.
internally displaced persons,
Разрушено не менее
and at
600
least
домов.
600 homes have been destroyed.
7 октября
Since the
2023 года
7th
на
of
западном
October
берегу задержано
2023, on the
порядка
West
16
Bank,
тысяч человек.
around 16,000 people have
Не
been
прекращаются
detained.
провокации со стороны
The
поселенцев.
provocations
Так,
continue by
50
settlers.
поселенческих экстремистов
50 extremist
устроили погром в
settlers
палестинскую
organized a
деревню
pogrom
Дума.
in the Palestinian
К
village
сожалению,
of
израильские
Duma.
власти не только не
Unfortunately, the
наказывают
Israeli
нарушителей, но
authorities
и
are not only
зачастую
not punishing the
потворствуют им.
offenders, but they are often indulging them.
С беспрецедентной скоростью осуществляется израильская
The Israeli
поселенческая
settlement
экспансия на
expansion on
западном
the West
берегу реки
Bank is
Иордан.
taking place with unprecedented
47%
speed.
которого уже
47% of the West Bank
фактически
has
отняты у
already
палестинцев.
essentially been taken away from Palestinians.
За 3 месяца
In the
нынешнего
first
года
3
одобрено
months of this
строительство
year, the
10
construction of
503 единиц
10,503
жилья,
housing units
что
has been
превышает
approved,
аналогичный
which
показатель за
is
весь
higher than the
2024
similar
год.
figure for the whole of
По некоторым
2024.
оценкам, при
By
таком
some
темпе за 2
assessments, at
года
this rate, in
будет
2 years'
полностью
time,
перечеркнуты какие-либо
any
перспективы
prospects
государственного
for the
решения.
two-state solution will be
Уже
entirely
сегодня
wiped out.
западный берег
Even
практически
today, the
разделен на
West
две
Bank
части
is
из-за
essentially divided
инфраструктурных
into
проектов
two
Израиля
parts
в
because
Иерусалиме.
of Israel's infrastructure
А сотни
projects in
КПП по всему
Jerusalem,
западному
and
берегу
hundreds of checkpoints across the
серьезно
West Bank are
ограничивают
seriously
повседневную
restricting the
деятельность
daily
палестинцев.
activities of Palestinians.
Подобные действия вполне
Such
укладываются
actions
в
are
предпринятые
entirely in
Израилем на
line
протяжении
with
последних
Israel's
десятилетий на
practice over
западном берегу
decades in the
шаги,
West Bank
исключающие
of taking
сохранение
steps
территориальной
that
непрерывности
rule out the
оккупированных
continued
палестинских территорий.
contiguity of the OPT.
Ключевыми моментами
Key
подобной
parts
тактики
of
стали
this
поселенческие
tactic
блоки,
are settlement blocks
связанная
and
инфраструктура,
related infrastructure,
разделительная
the
стена,
dividing
система
wall,
блокпостов
the
и
system of
КПП,
roadblocks and
разрушение
checkpoints,
палестинских
and the
строений,
destruction of
конфискация
Palestinian
земель,
buildings, the
проведение
confiscation
регулярных
of land,
силовых рейдов,
and organizing regular
вылившихся
security
в
raids,
настоящее
which are
время
now
в полноценные
spilling
операции
over
в Дженине,
into
Туль-Карме и
fully-fledged operations in Jenin, Tulkarm, and other cities.
Нас также Крайне
We are
беспокоит
also
более
deeply
широкий
concerned
региональный
by the
контекст.
broader regional context.
Возобновление произвольных
The
израильских
resumption
ударов по
of
Бейруту,
arbitrary Israeli strikes on
непрекращающийся авианалет
Beirut
на Сирию,
and continuing
удары
airstrikes
США
on
по
Syria,
Йемену,
US
а также
strikes on Yemen,
начавшаяся
and
подготовка
also the
общественного мнения
preparations
к полномасштабной
for public
операции
opinion
против
for
Ирана.
a full-scale operation against Iran.
В итоге сегодня весь ближневосточный
In
регион
sum,
оказался
today the
еще
entire Middle
ближе
East
к
region
масштабному
is
вооруженному
closer to a
конфликту,
large-scale
последствия которого будут
large-scale
катастрофическими.
conflict, the consequences of which would be catastrophic.
Призываем всех
We
отойти
call
от этой
upon
опасной
all
черты.
to step back from this dangerous brink.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
логика
the
войны
logic of
полностью
war
исключает возможность
fully
возвращения
rules
израильских
out any
заложников домой.
possibility of returning home
В этой
the
парадигме
Israeli
есть место
hostages.
новым
In this
бессмысленным
paradigm,
смертям и
there's space for
разрушениям,
further senseless deaths
братским
and
могилам
destructions,
врачей, тысячам
mass
убитых
graves of
детей.
doctors, thousands
Эта
of
же
children
логика
killed.
исключает
But that
перспективу
same logic
восстановления
rules
Газы,
out prospects for the
реалистично
reconstruction of
обрисованные
Gaza
в
that was
предложенном
realistically
арабском
outlined
государственном плане.
in the plan proposed by the Arab states.
В нечеловеческих условиях, в которых
In the
вынуждены выживать
inhumane
жители
conditions
анклава, и
that
которые
the
создаются на
residents of the
западном
enclave
берегу,
have to survive in and
формируется
that are being
питательная
created in the
среда
West
для
Bank, a breeding
радикализации
ground
и
is being
взращивания
created for
ненависти к
radicalization
Израилю и его
and
жителям.
breeding hatred for Israel and its
Что
people.
толку для Западного Иерусалима
What is the point
устранения
for
Хамас,
West
если
Jerusalem of
его
getting
место
rid of
займут
Hamas
другие люди
if
под другой
its place is
вывеской,
occupied
для
by
которых борьба с
other
Израилем
people with
будет
another name,
представляться
for whom the
единственным
struggle with
способом
Israel will be
восстановления
the only
справедливости?
way for them to restore
По факту,
justice? In
десятилетия
fact,
отсутствия справедливого решения
decades without a
палестино-израильского
just solution
конфликта
to
и
the
привели
Palestinian-Israeli
к нынешней
conflict is precisely
трагической
what led
ситуации.
to the present tragic situation.
Убеждены в
We are
необходимости
convinced of the
немедленного и
need
безусловного
for an immediate
прекращения
and
огня,
unconditional
освобождения
ceasefire,
всех
the release
насильственно
of all
удерживаемых лиц
forcibly
и
detained
обеспечения
persons,
безопасного
and
и
ensuring
беспрепятственного
safe and
гуманитарного доступа.
unhindered humanitarian access.
При этом важно,
At
чтобы
the same time, it
достигнутые
is
договоренности
important that
носили
the
устойчивый
agreements
характер.
reached are
Как
sustainable.
показывает практика,
As practice
без гарантий и
shows,
контроля со
without
стороны
guarantees and
международного
oversight by
сообщества,
the
любые
international
перемирия
community, any
могут рухнуть в
truces could
одночасье.
collapse overnight.
В этой связи Совет
In that regard,
Безопасности ООН
the UN
обязан
Security
сыграть
Council
ключевую роль
must
в
play a
переговорном
key role
процессе
in the
и в
negotiating
обеспечении
process
соблюдения его
and in
результатов всеми
ensuring
сторонами.
compliance with its outcomes by all
Призываем
parties.
международных
We call
посредников
upon international
сделать приоритетом
mediators
своих
to make
усилий
this priority
возвращение
in
к
their
мирному
efforts to
регулированию.
return to the peace
В данном
process.
контексте
In this
хотели бы вновь
context, we would
подтвердить
like to
нашу
once again
неизменную
confirm
приверженность
our
созданию
unchanging
независимого
commitment to the
палестинского
creation of
государства
an
в границах
independent Palestinian state
1967
in the
года со столицей
1967
Восточного
borders with
Иерусалима.
East Jerusalem as its capital.
Оно должно существовать в мире
It
и
must
безопасности
coexist
с
in peace
Израилем
and
в
security
соответствии с
with
одобренными
Israel in
международно
accordance
правовыми
with the
решениями.
approved international legal decisions.
Коллеги, в складывающихся
Colleagues,
обстоятельствах
in these circumstances,
крайне опасные последствия может иметь
there
сохранение
could be
вакуума
dangerous
на
consequences for
ключевых
the
ООНовских постах
preserving
в
of a
регионе.
vacuum in key
Спецкоординатора
posts
по
in
БГУ
the
и старшего
region, the special
координатора по
coordinator
оказанию
for the peace
гуманитарной
process
помощи
and the senior
палестинцам.
coordinator for assistance to the
Призываем
Palestinians.
Генсекретаря
We call
ООН
upon
как
the UN
можно
Secretary
скорее
General as quickly
представить
as
Совету
possible
Безопасности
to
ООН
present the UN
соответствующие
Security
кандидатуры.
Council with candidates to that effect.
В завершение хотел бы
In
подчеркнуть,
conclusion, we would
что
like to
в
underscore
отношении возможных
that
практических шагов
as
со
regards
стороны
possible
Совета
practical steps by the
и
Council
принятие его продуктов
and
в
the
связи
adoption
с
of
обострением
products
кризиса в Газе,
related to
мы
the worsening
ориентируемся на
crisis in
позицию
Gaza,
арабской
we are
группы.
guided by the position of the Arab group.
Готовы также
We
работать
also
со
stand
всеми,
ready to work
кто
with
ставит перед собой
everyone
задачу добиться
that
справедливого,
wants to achieve a
долгосрочного и
just,
устойчивого
long-term
мира
and
на Ближнем
sustainable
Востоке
peace in the Middle
на
East
основе
on the
известных
basis
решений
of
Совета
the
Безопасности
well-known
ООН в
Security
контексте
Council
палестино-израильского
decisions in the
регулирования.
context of the Palestinian-Israeli peace
Благодарю за
process.
внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant
I
de la
thank the
Fédération
representative
Russie
of the
et je
Russian
donne
Federation.
la
I
parole à Monsieur
now
le
give the
représentant
floor
de
to the
Sierra
permanent
Leone.
representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for convening this meeting at the request of Algeria, with support from the Russian Federation, China, Pakistan, and Somalia on the concerning situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. I thank High Commissioner Volkan Turk for his comprehensive and sobering briefing. I commend Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib, President of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, for the selfless humanitarian work in the most difficult and dangerous circumstances, and I thank him for the compelling contribution. Sierra Leone is gravely alarmed by the rapidly deteriorating situation in the OPT. The humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza and the surge in violence across the West Bank demand urgent and sustained attention by the Security Council. Every additional day of conflict means more lives lost, more families shattered. The killing must stop. We must uphold our collective responsibility to protect human life and dignity under international law. For weeks, Gaza has endured a total blockade, coupled with relentless bombardment. For over a month, no food, water, fuel, or electricity entered Gaza, creating a man-made crisis of epic proportions. Around 90% of Gaza's population is now displaced, many multiple times. The entire population depends on humanitarian assistance for survival. Despite soaring needs, life-saving relief has been obstructed. Hospitals have shut down for lack of fuel and security, while thousands of wounded civilians go untreated. Water, food, and medicine are critically scarce. The civilian population is exhausted, starving, and desperate. Humanitarian workers have not been spared. Since October 2023, at least 369 aid workers, including 263 UNRWA staff, have been killed. They are among the highest casualty figures ever recorded for humanitarian personnel in any conflict. Most were Palestinians, serving their own communities. We express our deepest condolences to the family of the aid workers killed. Sierra Leone strongly deplores these killings and all attacks on humanitarian personnel. These actions are not just violations of international law, they are violations of our shared humanity. The legal obligations are clear. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention and customary international law, the State of Israel, as the occupying power, is responsible for the safety and welfare of the civilian population in the OPT. This includes ensuring access to food, water, medicine, and other essentials. These are not aspirational principles. They are binding rules that save lives. We therefore draw the attention to the binding provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in the application of the Genocide Convention, South Africa versus Israel case. The ICJ has ordered the State of Israel to ensure the provision of basic humanitarian necessities to Gaza. The provisional measures are binding under international law. To date, these measures have not been respected. The defiance and seeming impunity undermine the credibility of the international legal system and even this Council. Mr. President, even as Gaza is being plummeted by bombs, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is witnessing an alarming escalation. Since 7 October 2023, settler violence against Palestinians has more than doubled. Attacks include assault, arson, and destruction of homes and livelihood, and often reportedly carried out in the presence or with the acquiescence of Israeli security forces. We are deeply concerned by reports of entire Palestinian villages being emptied following settler threats, violence, and forced displacement. These acts are occurring in a climate of impunity, defying the State of Israel's obligation as the occupying power to protect civilians under international humanitarian law. We recall the advisory opinion of the ICJ regarding the legal consequences arising from the policies and practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and the clear view of the World Court that, and I quote, "The State of Israel is under an obligation to bring to an end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible." End of quote. The government of the State of Israel is, however, acting to the contrary. Sierra Leone is therefore gravely alarmed by these grave breaches of international law, including excessive force, punitive military raids, and settler violence. These abuses are part of a broader crisis and must be addressed accordingly and immediately. Without accountability, tensions will continue to rise. Impunity entrenches, and prospects for peace will further diminish. Respect for international law is not optional. We reiterate that all parties must comply. That includes Palestinian armed groups, notably Hamas, We continue to strongly condemn the deliberate targeting of Israeli civilians, the killing of non-combatants, and the taking of hostages. These actions violate international law and must cease. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. The principle of humanity applies to all. There can be no double standards. Israeli and Palestinian lives are equally valuable, and no civilian anywhere should live in fear of violence, starvation, or displacement. Mr. President, the Security Council cannot remain a passive observer. We have heard the Secretary General's call for humanitarian ceasefire. We have seen the ICJ issue binding orders. We have witnessed immense courage for humanitarian workers facing fire to deliver aid. The Council must continue to act, even if within the framework of Resolution 2735. Sierra Leone therefore calls for the following urgent steps. First, an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The Council must call for all hostilities to stop, and now. The continuation of military operations in densely populated areas only guarantees further death and destruction. There is no military solution. A political process must begin with silencing the guns. Second, the Council to demand for unimpeded humanitarian access and aid. Gaza must be fully and consistently accessible to humanitarians and for humanitarian aid. Safe corridors must be established for the delivery of food, fuel, medicine, and the treatment or evacuation of the sick and wounded. All obstacles to aid, including blockades and administrative delays, must be removed immediately. In this regard, we call for the full implementation of all Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. Third, on the release of hostages and detainees. All hostages held by armed groups must be freed without delay. No cause justifies the captivity of civilians. At the same time, we cannot ignore the thousands of Palestinians, including children, held in detention, often without due process. Their rights must also be respected. We encourage all parties to re-engage in the mediation efforts leading to mutual releases. Beyond these steps, Sierra Leone urges renewed international commitment to a just and lasting peace based on international law and the relevant resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council. The current escalation has again demonstrated that the status quo of occupation, blockade, and repeated violence is untenable. We must redouble efforts towards a political solution that ends the occupation and secures the legitimate rights and security of both Palestinian and Israeli. The devastation in Gaza and the West Bank is a blight on the conscience of the world. This Council must not look away. The violence must end, the collective punishment must end, the suffering must end. Let us act not only in words, but through clear and principled actions. Let us demonstrate that the United Nations still stands for the protection of the vulnerable and the upholding of international law. Sierra Leone stands ready to support all efforts towards de-escalation, humanitarian relief, and a path to peace. I thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant
I
permanent
thank
de
the
Sierra
permanent
Leone et je
representative of
donne la
Sierra
parole
Leone. I give the
Monsieur le
floor
représentant
to
permanent
the
de Panama.
permanent representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you
señor
very
presidente.
much, Mr. President.
Panamá
Panama
agradece al
is grateful
representante de Algeria
to the representative
su
of
iniciativa para
Algeria
la convocatoria
for
de
his
esta sesión
initiative to
informativa
convene this briefing.
y valora
We
las
value
exposiciones de
the
Volker
briefings
Turk,
delivered by Volker
Alto
Turk,
Comisionado de las
United
Naciones
Nations High
Unidas para los
Commissioner for
Derechos Humanos,
Human Rights,
y el doctor
and
Younes
by
Al-Khatib,
Dr. Younes
presidente
Al-Khatib,
de la
President of
Sociedad
the
de la
Palestine
Media Luna
Red
Roja
Crescent
Palestina,
Society.
quienes han
They
detallado
have both provided
sobre
details of
pormenores de la ya muy prolongada crisis
the
humanitaria en Gaza
protracted
y
humanitarian
Cisjordania,
crisis in
que
Gaza
continúa
and the West Bank.
deteriorándose con
This crisis
consecuencias
continues to
humanas
worsen with
cada
human
vez más
consequences that are
devastadoras.
increasingly increasingly devastating in
mes
nature.
después
1
del
month
cierre
after
total
the
de los
total
cruces de
closure
acceso a
of
Gaza,
crossings allowing
las
access into
agencias
Gaza,
humanitarias
humanitarian
advierten que
agencies
las
have
reservas de
warned
alimentos,
that reserves
medicinas,
of food,
combustible
medicines,
y agua
fuel,
potable
and drinking
se han
water
agotado.
have already run
El
out.
Programa Mundial
The
de
World
Alimentos
Food Program
ha
has
confirmado el cierre
confirmed
de las
the
25
closure
panaderías
of
que aún
the
operaban con su apoyo
25 bakeries that were
debido a
continuing
la
to
falta de
operate with its
suministros.
support, this owing to a
Y
lack of
UNICEF
supplies. Moreover,
alerta
UNICEF
que
has
cerca
warned
de
that around
130 niños
130
nacen
children
cada
are
día
born
en
every
condiciones
day in
precarias de
extremely
extrema vulnerabilidad,
precarious conditions
sin
and
alimentos,
conditions of extreme
sin atención
vulnerability,
médica
without food,
y
without
sin
medical
acceso a
care, and with
hospitales
no
funcionales.
access to functioning hospitals.
Instamos a que en un gesto que sería enaltecedor se
We
permita el
need
acceso
to
urgente
see
de la
the
vital
flag
ayuda
flown high
humanitaria.
of morality
Desde la
and
reanudación
immediate
de las
humanitarian
hostilidades el
access
18 de
allowed.
marzo,
Since the
más de
resumption
1,000
of
personas
hostilities
han
on the
muerto.
18th of March, more than
Entre ellos,
1,000
al menos
people died, of which
322 eran
322
niños,
at least were
mientras
children.
otros
Another
609 han
609
resultado
have
heridos.
been wounded.
En lo que lleva esta trágica
Since the
guerra,
beginning of this
más de 1
tragic
millón de
war,
menores
more
han sido
than 1 million
desplazados
children have been
repetidamente,
repeatedly displaced,
sobreviviendo en refugios
surviving
improvisados
in makeshift
entre la
shelters
basura
among
acumulada y
piles
sin
of rubbish
servicios
and with
básicos.
no access to
Apenas
essential
ayer,
services. Only
un centro de
yesterday,
salud de
an
UNRWA,
UNRWA clinic
ubicado en Jabalia,
located
en el
in
norte de la
Jabalia in the
franja,
north of
que
the strip
funcionaba
that was
como refugio
functioning
para
as
más
a
de
shelter
700
for more than
personas desplazadas,
700
fue
people,
impactado,
displaced people,
causando la
was
muerte de 15
attacked,
personas,
caused the death of
incluyendo
15
9 niños,
people, including
entre
9
ellos un
children,
recién nacido de
among
apenas 2
which was
semanas
a
y
newborn
2
of only
mujeres.
2 weeks old. 2
Según
women were
UNRWA,
also killed.
muchas
According to
familias se
UNRWA,
resisten a
many
abandonar
families
el
are
centro,
opposed to leaving the center,
simplemente
quite
porque no
simply
tienen a
because they
dónde
have
ir.
nowhere to go.
Panamá lamenta
Panama
profundamente la
deeply
pérdida
regrets
de
the
vidas
loss of
inocentes
innocent
e
lives
insta a
and
detener las
urges the
hostilidades de
immediate cessation
inmediato
of
y a
hostilities
proteger a la
and
población
the
civil,
protection of the civilian
especialmente a
population,
mujeres,
particularly of
niños y
women,
trabajadores
children, and
humanitarios.
humanitarian workers.
Señor Presidente,
Mr. President,
a lo anterior
in addition
se
to
suma que
the
las
details
condiciones para la
outlined
asistencia
above,
humanitaria
conditions have made
no
the
solo se han
provision of
vuelto
humanitarian
inviables,
assistance
sino que
not only
también
impracticable,
extremadamente
but also
peligrosas
incredibly
para quienes operan
perilous
sobre el
for
terreno.
those working on the
Causa
ground. It is
preocupación
a source of concern
conocer
to
noticias
receive
como las circuladas el
news such
31 de
as
marzo
that from the
que se
31st of
refieren
March
al hallazgo en
regarding
Gaza
the
de más de
finding
una
in Gaza
decena de
of more
víctimas
than some
encontradas
10
bajo
victims.
escombros
They
y
were
arena,
found under the rubble
identificadas
and
como
under the
miembros
sand and were
de la Media Luna
identified as
Roja
members of the
Palestina,
Palestine Red
la
Crescent
Defensa Civil
Society as well
Palestina
as of the
y
Palestinian
entre
Civil
ellos
Defense.
un funcionario de
And
Naciones
these
Unidas,
people
todos
included
reportados como
one UN worker.
desaparecidos
All had been
desde el
missing
23 de
since
marzo.
the 23rd of March.
Nuestras condolencias
Our
vayan a sus
condolences go
familiares.
to their loved ones.
Como lo hemos manifestado
As we have
anteriormente,
stated on previous
reiteramos
occasions, we
que
reiterate the
hechos
fact
graves
that
como estos
gravely serious
precisan
events such as these
investigaciones
require
exhaustivas
comprehensive
que permitan
inquiries
esclarecer
in
sus
order to
circunstancias,
clarify
disipar
surrounding
dudas y
circumstances,
deslindar las
dissipate doubt,
responsabilidades
and
correspondientes,
identify those responsible.
ya que
This
constituyen
is
ejemplos
because these events
lamentables
stand as
de
deplorable
incidentes que no
examples
deben
of
ocurrir
incidents which
y
must
que
not
ponen de
occur,
manifiesto de
and
manera
incidents
dramática
which
la
starkly
necesidad de
underline
proteger a
the
los
need to
civiles
protect
y al
civilians
personal
and
humanitario en
humanitarian
contextos de
personnel
conflicto
in
armado.
contexts of armed
Desde el
conflict.
inicio del
Since
conflicto en
the
Gaza,
beginning of the
al
conflict in
menos
Gaza, at least
408 trabajadores
408
humanitarios
humanitarian
han
workers
perdido la
have
vida.
lost their lives.
Estos trabajadores
These workers
murieron
died
mientras
while
intentaban salvar
endeavoring to
vidas.
save lives.
Panamá insiste
Panama
en el llamado a que se
fervently
garantice en todo
appeals
momento
to
y por todas las
all
partes
parties at
la
all
protección
times
del
to
personal
guarantee the
humanitario
protection of
y la
humanitarian personnel
inviolabilidad de
and
sus
the
instalaciones.
inviolability of
Señor
humanitarian
Presidente,
premises.
pedimos
Mr.
que se
President,
restablezca
we
con
call
urgencia
for the
el
urgent
alto al fuego en
restoration
Gaza.
of the ceasefire
Los
in
días en
Gaza.
que la tregua,
The days
aunque
during which
débil,
the
estuvo
truce,
en
however
vigor,
weak, was enforced,
demostraron que la asistencia
demonstrated that
humanitaria
humanitarian
puede
assistance
llegar
can arrive
y es
and
posible
that
la
it is
liberación
possible
de
to
rehenes,
release hostages.
los cuales
We
no podemos
cannot
olvidar
forget
que
those
continúan
that are still
retenidos por
being
parte de
detained
Hamas en
by
Gaza.
Hamas in Gaza.
La situación de esos
The
rehenes
situation
sigue
for these
siendo
hostages
incierta.
remains uncertain.
Una vez más,
Once again,
exigimos
we
su liberación
demand their
inmediata e
immediate and
incondicional,
unconditional
así
release.
como que se les garantice con urgencia
Their
protección,
protection,
atención
medical
médica
care,
y
and
contacto con
contact
sus
with their
familias.
families must also be
Señor
urgently
Presidente,
guaranteed.
al
Mr.
igual que en
President,
Gaza, Panamá observa con
Just
preocupación
as we
el
do in
creciente
Gaza, we
deterioro
note
de la
with
situación en
concern that the
Cisjordania.
situation in the
Los
West Bank
informes
continues
recientes
to
describen un
worsen. Recent
entorno
reports
cada
describe
vez más
an
coercitivo,
environment of
marcado
increasingly
por
acute
desplazamientos
coercion, one
forzados,
marked by forcible
demoliciones de
displacement,
viviendas,
demolition of
violencia
homes,
recurrente y
recurrent
severas
violence, and
restricciones de
severe
movimiento
movement
que
restrictions,
afectan la
all of
vida
which
cotidiana
affect the daily
de miles
lives
de
of
personas.
thousands of people.
Reiteramos la
We
importancia de que
reiterate
todas
the
las acciones
importance
sobre
of
el terreno
ensuring
se
that all
ajusten
actions on the ground
estrictamente a las normas del
stringently
derecho
adhere to the
internacional,
norms of international
incluido el
law,
derecho internacional
including
humanitario
to
y
international
en las
humanitarian
resoluciones
law
adoptadas por
and
este
the
Consejo,
resolutions adopted
cuyo
by this very
cumplimiento es
council.
esencial
Compliance with all of the
para
above is
preservar la
vital
dignidad
to
humana
preserve
y
human
avanzar
dignity
hacia una
and to
solución
move towards a
integral.
comprehensive
Señor
solution.
Presidente,
Mr.
el
President,
prolongado
the
sufrimiento que se
protracted
vive tanto en
suffering
Gaza como en
playing out both
Cisjordania
in Gaza and
es
the West Bank
abrumador
is
y
overwhelming
no puede
and cannot
desvincularse
be
de las
viewed in
decisiones y acciones
isolation from the
extremistas
decisions and
que han
extremist
exacerbado
acts
el
that have
conflicto,
worsened the conflict.
como lo fue,
These
sobre
acts
todo,
include,
el
first and
ataque del
foremost,
7 de
the
octubre
attack of the
y
7th
la
of
toma de
October
rehenes
and
por
the
parte
taking
de
of
Hamas,
hostages by Hamas,
actos
all of
inhumanos
which
que
were
Panamá siempre ha
inhumane acts
condenado.
that Panama has
El
always condemned.
trágico resultado
The
de esa
tragic
barbaridad
result of this
es que hoy
barbarism is that
miles de
today
familias
thousands
palestinas
of
se enfrentan
Palestinian
condiciones
families are
críticas.
in critical
Mujeres
conditions.
obligadas a dar a luz
Women
en
are forced to
refugios
give birth in
improvisados
makeshift
y sin atención
shelters and
postnatal.
with no postnatal
Niños que
care.
pierden la vida por
Children are
causas que
losing
podrían
their
haberse
lives
evitado
where
en
their
medio de
deaths
un
could have been
sistema de
avoided.
salud
This in the
colapsado
midst of a
y
health
una grave
system that has
escasez de
collapsed
servicios
and
básicos para
grave
la población.
shortages of essential
Cada una
services for the
de estas
population.
realidades
Each of these
demuestra
realities
que insistir en
demonstrates
la vía militar y
that
el extremismo
insisting
solo
that there is a
perpetúa
military
el
solution and
sufrimiento.
insisting on
Solo
extremism
una
only
solución
perpetuates
política,
suffering. Only a political
profundamente
solution,
humana
one
y
which is deeply
moralmente
human in nature
ineludible,
and morally
libre
imperative,
del
free
extremismo de
of
Hamas,
Hamas
podrá sentar
extremism,
las bases para una
would
paz
be
duradera
able to
para
lay the
israelíes y
lay the
palestinos.
foundations for a
En ese
lasting
camino,
peace for the
Panamá
Israelis and the
respaldará
Palestinians.
todas las
On this journey,
las
Panama
iniciativas
will
que
support all
contribuyan a
initiatives that
hacerla
contribute to
posible.
making that reality
Gracias.
possible. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur le
I
représentant
thank
du Panama
the
pour sa
representative
déclaration et
of
je
Panama
donne
for
la
his statement.
parole à Monsieur le
I give the
représentant
floor
de la
to
République de
the
Corée.
permanent representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank High Commissioner Volker Turk and the President of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Dr. Al-Khatib, for their detailed briefings. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea reiterates its deep concern over the situation in occupied Palestinian territory, where innocent Palestinian civilians are incessantly suffering under prolonged and intense hostilities and the lack of basic necessities. In Gaza, we are appalled by the repeated incidents where civilians and humanitarian workers were hit by deadly Israeli strikes. Yesterday's announcement that Israel will seize more land in Gaza militarily further deepens our concern over the endless suffering of Palestinian civilians. The targeting of an UNRWA clinic building in northern Gaza just yesterday and the school of Gaza City today, which resulted in dozens of child casualties, as well as the discovery of a mass grave filled with the bodies of aid workers, including 8 PRCS members, are outrageous and tragic developments. We note Israel's announcement indicating that the IDF intended to target Hamas operatives. However, the clear fact is that the majority of those killed in such instances were innocent civilians, including children and humanitarian workers. Such an attack is simply unacceptable. Hamas is also violating international humanitarian law. The rockets fired by Hamas and other militants from civilian infrastructure targeting population centers in Israel are unjustifiable. Thus, we reiterate our demand that all the parties to the conflict, notably Israel, must adhere to the principles of international humanitarian law, including those of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. Thorough and credible investigations should follow for all alleged violations of international law, and perpetrators must be held accountable. We also stress that it is the occupying power's legal obligation to permit free passage of humanitarian relief. Thus, we once again call on Israel to allow entry of aid and commercial goods into Gaza. Hamas' refusal to an immediate and unconditional release of hostages is unconscionable, but this does not legitimize the blocking of humanitarian aid. Mr. President, as other colleagues here in this chamber have pointed out, the situation in the West Bank is also disturbing. The current military operations in northern West Bank by Israel are causing large-scale death, destruction, and displacement for civilians. Expansion of settlements in clear violation of international law and Security Council Resolution 2334, as well as rampant settler violence, are driving Palestinians off their land and must be stopped. Moreover, inflammatory statements and actions, such as senior Israeli officials' visits to holy sites, are further worsening instability in the West Bank and beyond. Mr. President, since the collapse of the ceasefire in Gaza last month, we are witnessing a repetition of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, as well as risky escalation and further disruptions in the broader Middle East, including Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. As such, we call on both parties to listen to the desperate voices of innocent Palestinian civilians, the voices of Israeli hostages still held in Gaza, as well as those Palestinians protesting against the brutal rule of Hamas, including Uday, a young participant at the anti-Hamas protest who was then tortured to death. In closing, Mr. President, Israel has the right to protect itself in line with international humanitarian law. However, military means cannot secure sustainable peace and stability for Israelis and their neighbors. Considering the overarching importance of a resolution to the Palestinian question for sustainable peace in the region, we strongly believe that forging a long-term peaceful political environment in the Middle East is directly interconnected with the advancement of the two-state solution. We hope that, starting with a successful ceasefire hostage release deal, a sincere discussion for the reconstruction of Gaza and for coexistence between Israel and Palestine based on the two-state solution can follow in a meaningful way. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie M. le
I
rapporteur
thank
permanent
the
de
permanent representative
la Corée pour sa
of the
déclaration
Republic
et
of
je vais
Korea for
maintenant
that statement.
faire une
I shall
déclaration
now
en ma
make a
qualité de
statement in my
représentant de la
capacity as the
France.
representative of France.
La France remercie
France
Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire des
thanks
Nations
the
Unies aux droits de l'homme,
UN High Commissioner for
M.
Human
Volker
Rights,
Turk et
Mr.
Monsieur le
Volker
Président du
Turk,
Croissant-Rouge
and the
palestinien, le
President of
Dr
the
Younes
Palestine
El-Khatib,
Red
pour
Crescent,
leurs
Dr. Younes
interventions qui nous ont
Al-Khatib. We
éclairés.
thank them for their briefings that were
Notre
enlightening.
Conseil s'est
Our
réuni à maintes
Council
reprises ces
has met
dernières
on
semaines
several
pour évoquer
occasions
le
in
sort des
recent
otages, la
weeks to
situation à
discuss the
Gaza,
fate of hostages,
la
the situation
colonisation
in
en
Gaza,
Cisjordanie et la protection
settlement
du
activity in
personnel
the West
humanitaire.
Bank and the protection of humanitarian
L'extrême gravité de la situation
humanitarian
exige, nos
personnel. The extremely
intervenants l'ont
grave nature of this
rappelé,
situation demanded
mais la
us to do
situation
so, as speakers
actuelle
have
appelle
said.
surtout à
However,
l'action
the
du
current
Conseil,
situation calls
à la
above all
fois
for
dans
the Council's
l'immédiat
action,
pour
both
faire
in
taire
the
les armes
immediate
et
term
reprendre les
to
rues
silence the
humanitaires,
guns
mais
and see
aussi
the
pour
resumption of
sur le long
humanitarian
terme,
aid, but
il faut
also
restaurer
action in the
un
long
horizon
term is
politique pour
necessary
les
to
Israéliens
restore
comme
a
pour les
political
Palestiniens.
horizon both for the
Et
Israelis
pour ce
and the
faire,
Palestinians.
l'offensive
To do
israélienne
that,
doit
the
cesser.
Israeli offensive must
Le président de la
stop.
République l'a
The
dit, il n'y
President
aura
of
pas
the
de
Republic
solution
said so.
militaire
There
à
will
Gaza.
be no military
La
solution
rupture
in
du
Gaza. The
cessez-le-feu et la
breakdown
reprise
of
des
the
frappes
ceasefire and
israéliennes
the
à
resumption
Gaza
of Israeli strikes in
constituent un
Gaza
retour en arrière
constitute
dramatique.
a
Il est
catastrophic
urgent que
step
les hostilités
backwards. It
cessent.
is
Et nous
urgent
saluons les
for
efforts de
hostilities
médiation
to cease, and
déployés
we
par les
commend the
États-Unis,
mediation efforts
l'Égypte et
deployed
le
by the
Qatar.
US, Egypt, and Qatar.
Tous les otages doivent
All
être libérés
hostages
sans
must
plus
be
de délai et dans la
released without
dignité.
delay
Ils n'ont
and
que
in
trop
dignity.
souffert.
They have suffered for too
Le
long.
Hamas doit mettre un
Hamas
terme
must put
au
an
traitement
end
inhumain,
to the
dégradant et
inhumane,
humiliant qu'ils
degrading, and
subissent. Nous sommes
humiliating
solidaires de leur
treatment
calvaire,
given to these
solidaires de
hostages.
leurs familles.
They
Nous sommes solidaires du peuple
are
israélien face aux
in
attaques
hell.
terroristes
We stand in
commises
solidarity
par le
with their
Hamas et d'autres
families
groupes terroristes
and
le 7
with
octobre
the Israeli people
2023
following
que
the
la
terrorist
France
attacks
ne cessera
perpetrated
de
by
condamner.
Hamas and other terrorist groups on the
Dans
7th of
l'immédiat
October
également,
2023.
le
France
blocage
will
de l'aide
continue to
humanitaire doit
condemn
prendre
these.
fin.
In the
Nous
immediate
l'avons
term,
dit
the humanitarian
vendredi,
blockade must
hier,
end,
et
as
nous
we
le
said
disons à
on
nouveau aujourd'hui,
Friday,
la
yesterday, and as
protection
we
des
state
travailleurs
again today. The
humanitaires
protection
qui
of
ont déjà payé
humanitarian
un lourd
personnel
tribut
that
à
have
Gaza
already paid a
doit
high
être
price in
garantie
Gaza
en dans toutes
must be
circonstances,
guaranteed in all
conformément au droit
circumstances in
international.
accordance with
Nous
international
condamnons
law.
les tirs
We
israéliens
condemn
sur des
Israeli
ambulances qui
fire
ont tué
upon
15 secouristes à
ambulances,
Gaza.
a fire
Le
which
ministre de
killed
l'Europe et
15
des Affaires
rescue
étrangères,
workers
M.
in
Jean-Noël
Gaza. The
Barrot, l'a dit,
Minister for Europe
c'est
and Foreign
inacceptable.
Affairs,
Les
Jean-Noël
travailleurs
Barrot,
humanitaires ne
said the
devraient
following: These
jamais
attacks
être pris pour
were
cible.
unacceptable.
La France présente ses
Humanitarian workers must
condoléances
never be targeted.
aux
France
familles des 8
conveys
secouristes
its
du Croissant Rouge palestinien,
condolences to the
des 6
families of the
secouristes
8
de la
rescue workers
défense
of the
civile
Palestinian Red
et de l'employé de
Crescent, the
l'UNRWA.
6 rescue workers of
Toute
the
la lumière
Palestinian
sur
Civil
cette attaque
Defense, and
devrait
to the
être
families of
faite.
the UNRWA staff
Le sort
member.
du disparu
Full
doit
clarity
être
must
connu.
be achieved around this
Il faut
attack,
dès
and the
aujourd'hui
fate of those
travailler à
missing
définir les
must
contours du jour
be
d'après à Gaza. Nous
clarified.
le rappelons,
We must
l'avenir de
continue to
Gaza doit
build
être
Gaza's tomorrow.
palestinien.
Gaza's future
Nous nous
must be
opposons à tout déplacement
Palestinian.
forcé de
We
population
oppose any
et à toute
forcible
forme de
displacement
saisie de
of people and
territoire.
any form
Les
of
dirigeants
territorial
arabes
seizure.
présentent un plan
Arab leaders
crédible
have
pour la
presented a
reconstruction de
credible
Gaza,
plan for Gaza's
avec des propositions
reconstruction, with
concrètes pour
concrete
garantir la
proposals being
sécurité
made to
et
guarantee
installer une
security
nouvelle
and
gouvernance
establish a new
palestinienne
Palestinian
dont le
government
Hamas devra
from
être
which
exclu.
Hamas must be
La France, en lien
excluded.
avec ses
France,
partenaires européens,
alongside
soutient
its
ce plan
European
et
partners,
contribue à
supports
la
this plan
réflexion pour sa
and
mise en œuvre.
contributes to discussions
En
regarding its
Cisjordanie, la
implementation. In
perspective
the
de la
West Bank,
solution à deux
prospects
États
of the
est
two-state
rendue chaque
solution
jour plus
continue to
difficile.
fade
La
day
France
by
réitère sa
day.
condamnation de la
France
politique de
reiterates its
colonisation
condemnation
illégale en
for
droit
the
international,
settlement policy.
ainsi que les violences
This is
commises par les colons
illegal
extrémistes.
pursuant to international
Elle
law,
rappelle son
just as
opposition
is the
à toute forme
settler
d'annexion
violence.
et à
France once again
Jérusalem, le
opposes
statu
all
quo
forms
sur
of
les lieux saints doit
annexation,
être respecté.
and in Jerusalem, the status quo
Finalement,
of
les
holy sites
Palestiniens et
must
les
be
Israéliens
respected.
ont le
Finally,
droit de vivre en
Palestinians
paix
and
et en
Israeli
sécurité.
people have the right to live in peace
Cela
and
passe par des garanties de
security.
sécurité
Achieving
crédibles
that
pour
goal involves
Israël
providing
et
credible
l'édification d'un
security
État
guarantees
palestinien
to Israel
viable
and
et
ensuring the
continu.
construction of a viable,
Seule la solution
contiguous
des deux États
Palestinian
conduira à une
state.
paix juste et
Only the
durable,
two-state
et
solution
c'est
will
avec
lead
cette
to a just and
conviction
lasting
que la
peace. And
France
it is
prépare
fueled by
avec
this
l'Arabie
conviction that
saoudite
France,
à
together
New
with Saudi
York,
Arabia in
conformément
Europe,
à la
is
décision de l'Assemblée
preparing
générale,
a
une
conference in
conférence en
accordance
juin
with the
sur la mise
General
en œuvre de
Assembly
cette
decision,
solution.
a conference on the
Et pour l'heure,
implementation of that
l'urgence
solution.
commande, la libération
Now,
des
we
otages,
need to see the
la
release of
reprise du
hostages, the
cessez-le-feu et
resumption
une
of the
enquête
ceasefire, and
sur les
an
attaques contre les
inquiry
personnels
into
humanitaires,
attacks against
la reprise
humanitarian
immédiate de
personnel.
l'aide
There also needs to
humanitaire,
be the immediate resumption
l'arrêt
of
de la
humanitarian
colonisation,
aid,
tel
the
doit être le
cessation of
message de ce
the
Conseil.
settlement activity. That must urgently be this Council's message. Thank you.
Je reprends mes fonctions de président du
I
Conseil.
now resume my function as President of the Security
Je donne
Council.
maintenant la parole
I now give
à
the
Monsieur
floor to
l'observateur permanent de
the,
l'État observateur de Palestine.
Permanent representative of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting upon the request of Algeria and with the support of China, Pakistan, Russia, and Somalia. I want to thank Mr. Turk, High Commissioner of Human Rights, for his presence among us and his briefing. Allow me also, Mr. President, at the outset to salute Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib, and through him, the heroes of the Palestine Red Crescent Society and the other humanitarians who are also the victims, rescuers needing to be rescued. While this council was convening to address protection of humanitarians and its resolution 2730 yesterday, we were mourning 15 humanitarians, including 8 members of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, killed and buried under the sand together with their ambulances. A UN vehicle and a fire truck shot in their head and in their chest multiple times, with several of them with their hands and legs tied. They were executed for performing their sacred mission, killed for trying to save lives. And I sent to you, Mr. President, a few minutes ago, a tape that was sent to me that was found in the body of one of the martyrs who videotaped this attack against the convoy while all of the cars with their lights on and the sirens on when they were ambushed by the Israeli army. And I leave it up to your discretion to share it with our colleagues to see with their own eyes exactly what happened. I was also told that there is another longer tape. They are trying to make it available to all of you to see the evidence of this crime through the eyes of one of the victims. Mr. President, this is a multi-layered siege, blocking humanitarian aid completely, but also making sure the civilian population is denied any assistance by killing humanitarians, destroying hospitals, and bombing shelters. Yesterday, the world has watched again as Palestinian civilians, including children, were burnt alive after the bombing of an UNRWA clinic where they had found refuge. And today, an Israeli strike on a school in Gaza City, sheltering displaced families, killed, as far as we know now, the number went rising to at least 31 killed, and wounded at over 100, the majority of them women and children. Massacre after massacre after massacre. Israel's objectives is clear. Maximum despair to convince the Palestinian population that the only alternative to death is displacement out of Gaza. Mr. President, this is what Israel claims is pressure, quote unquote, killing tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians and denying them humanitarian aid indispensable to their very survival. Minister of War Katz confessed to this policy of collective punishment, and I quote, expanding the operation will increase the pressure on the Hamas murderers and also on the population in Gaza, end of quotation. He is not hiding that the target of this so-called pressure is the entire civilian population. What he dupes pressure being applied on the Palestinian population in Gaza is mass starvation, mass killing, mass destruction, mass displacement. He goes on to tell on the residents of Gaza to act now to remove Hamas and return all the hostages, saying this is the only way to end the war. So the civilians being killed and maimed and displaced are the ones who bear the responsibility to end the war. Palestinians want life. They want the genocide to end. They want the horrors to stop. They want to be treated as human beings. They want to mourn their dead and to try to find a way back to life. They are shouting it out to anybody willing to hear. Israeli bombs make no distinction. For them, all Palestinians are guilty and all of them deserve to die. This morning I listened to a speech by my brother Yunus Al-Khatib in a meeting organized by the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. In that meeting he said many moving things, but one sentence captured my attention. He said that we, humanitarians, our job is to save lives. We do not make peace. It is your job. He was referring to delegates. And I thought that that is very telling. Him and his likes, they are in the business of saving lives, although they are losing their lives while they are doing that, but it is the business of all of you to make peace. He made that statement. So I hope that you allow me to repeat it on your behalf, because I thought it would be very appropriate also to be shared by the mighty Security Council. Mr. President, Israel's true objective is not the release of the hostages, but stealing Palestinian land. After having spread death and devastation across Gaza, Netanyahu has announced he is now dissecting Gaza, cutting through the territory and splitting it into pieces to annex it. Netanyahu spoke of seizing territory, openly and unapologetically. Israel's Minister of War confessed to that too, saying that Israeli occupation forces will, and I quote, capture extensive territory that will be added to the state of Israel's security areas. End of quotation. Israeli leaders in parallel continue taunting and taking every action to advance the so-called voluntary migration, the code name for forcible transfer of Palestinians. The widespread condemnation of these Israeli actions have yet to translate into effective pressure to force it to stop. It is mind-boggling that such outrageous confessions to such terrifying crimes that have been taking place for such a long time with such an impact on millions of Palestinian civilians can still go unanswered. Mr. President, in the West Bank, the same ideology is at play. 40,000 Palestinians displaced within weeks, destructions and devastation of civilian infrastructure, and an unprecedented push for emptying land of its Palestinian population in the pursuit of permanent annexation. The E1 plan, which has been denounced internationally for 25 years, is now moving forward at an accelerated pace. It would further sever East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, cut the West Bank in two, and amounts to annexation of vast areas in the heart of the West Bank, thus dealing a fatal blow to peace efforts. We often speak of displacement of communities, but it is important that those sitting around this table fully grasp this reality. I wish that they could hear directly from Basil Adra from Masafer Yatta, who is sitting behind me back there. The man, the main protagonist and co-director of the Oscar-winning documentary No Other Land, who is present here, as I said, today, about all those Palestinians across the occupied Palestinian territory who just want to be able to live in their ancestral land and want what they face every day. How armed settlers, protected and enabled and accompanied by soldiers, attack Palestinian families and communities and terrorize them to push them to leave. How these communities build homes to see them destroyed, build them again to face another destruction, or to see them burned by settlers. How families end up living in caves to stay in their land. How they face the Israeli occupation army, the Israeli settlers, and the Israeli courts that coalesce to push them out. Mr. President, I began with Yunus and ended with Basil. I began with Gaza and ended with the West Bank. But I cannot forget Walid Ahmed, the 17-year-old boy who died in Israeli prisons last week. His autopsy showed severe muscle loss, colitis, and scabies, indicating he was subject, like many other Palestinian prisoners, to starvation, medical neglect, and ill treatment. Everywhere, Palestinians treated as subhumans, killed and maimed, and starved and tortured. When will the world's outrage lead to resolute action? When, I wonder. Mr. President, Palestinians are standing tall in the face of this occupation-made storm to uproot them or kill them where they stand. But they are tired, exhausted, mourning, and suffering. They are heroes, but not superheroes. They are humans, and they are victims. They need support and protection now more than ever. Will you listen to their calls, as my brother, Dr. Yunus Al-Khatib, end his statement by saying, are you listening to them? They want justice. Are you listening to them? In Masafir Yatta and in Gaza, in Nablus and in Jenin and in Tulkarim, and in Al-Khalil and in Jerusalem and beyond, Palestinians recorded live the crimes committed against them, thinking that if the world sees what Israel is doing, they will hold it accountable. The last evidence is the videotape that I sent to you, Mr. President. There are thousands, maybe tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these videotapes by Palestinians in Gaza documenting crimes against them. And this morning, I was among a group of ambassadors. We listened to Mr. Lazzarini about the situation of UNRWA and other issues. He made an appeal to us. He said, we need international journalists to come and document what is happening in Gaza. Not only to take them with the Israeli army so that the Israeli army to show them what they want to show. Do we have the spine, all of us, the Security Council, all of the European countries, the United States of America, which has the fourth power in its system, which is journalism and the media? Do you have the courage to send journalists to all parts of the Gaza Strip to document what is really happening to the Palestinian people and the genocide that they are being exposed to? Send journalists. That's what Mr. Lazzarini was urging us. The more than 24 ambassadors, most of them are from the European Union. Why aren't we sending journalists to document what is real and what is fake news in the Gaza Strip? And we urge you to add your voices to the demand and to the call of Mr. Lazzarini. Send journalists, send international journalists from the New York Times, from all media, from the BBC, to go and document what is really happening in the Gaza Strip. Now, the Palestinian people, I suppose, they wonder if impunity will ever end, if their lives will ever matter enough to trigger an appropriate reaction. This despair was reflected recently by a child shouting after the bombing of his house at a man filming him. What the hell are you filming? What for? Nobody is looking at us. Do you want the Palestinian people, the message to resonate deeper and deeper in their heads that the world is abandoning them, that the international community is abandoning them, that the Security Council is abandoning them? You see their images, their broken lives, their blood, their tears, their remains. These images move you. I know they do. But what matters to Palestinians is that they make you move. Not only to move you, but move. Resort to action. Do something. Stop this tragedy. Stop the killing of the Palestinians. Stop the firing. Demand a ceasefire, permanent ceasefire now, as you have decided in many resolutions, including Resolution 2735, and including the agreement, which was brokered by the United States of America, the current administration, few days before the inauguration of President Trump, and Egypt and Qatar. It was an agreement between Israel and Hamas, and those are the guarantors. Implement what you negotiated and you agreed to, and the Security Council reflected it in a Security Council resolution, the essence of it, 2735. You see their images, as I said, their broken lives, their blood, their tears, their remains. These images move you. I know they do, but what matters to Palestinians is that they make you move. They need to make governments across the world dare to do all the things they are still unwilling to do to bring this nightmare, this catastrophe to an end. Enough occupation and wars, enough suffering, enough bloodshed. We need ceasefire now. Support to the Arab reconstruction plan, concrete and decisive measures adopted at the International Conference on the Peace Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution to be held in June and co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France. The Council must clearly support such an immediate ceasefire in line with its Resolution 2735. It must support reconstruction, freedom, and peace in line with its mandate. Let life prevail. Let justice, freedom, and peace prevail. Let two states live side by side. Let all civilians be safe. Let our region unleash its true potential with shared peace, security, and prosperity. Yunus and Basil and so many others are doing their part. They need you to do yours. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Monsieur l'Observateur
I
permanent
thank
de
the
l'État observateur de
permanent
Palestine.
observer of the Observer State of
Votre
Palestine.
vidéo est mise à la
Your
disposition
video
des
has been
missions.
made available
du
to
Conseil de sécurité.
missions
Et je
of
donne
members of
maintenant
the
la
Security
parole
Council.
à
I
Monsieur
now
le
give the
représentant
floor
permanent
to the
d'Israël.
permanent representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start with my conclusion for our last debate. This war will not end until the 59 remaining innocent hostages are released and Hamas is driven from Gaza. Yet, every few days, this council convenes again to address the situation in Gaza, and every time the same pattern unfolds. Hamas commits an atrocity, Israel takes action to defend ourselves, and somehow the story that gets told in this room is upside down. Allow us to set the record straight. Take the incident on March 23 concerning the Red Crescent. Inside those vehicles, which are supposed to save lives, were active Hamas terrorists. 9 terrorists were eliminated, including Muhammad Amin Ibrahim Shubaki, a Hamas terrorist who directly took part in the October 7th massacre. I ask you, Mr. El-Khatib, what he was doing there? What he was doing in an ambulance, a Hamas terrorist who was in Israel on October 7th. Why he was connected to that? What is the connection between humanitarian work and terrorists of Hamas? Israel mourns the loss of innocent life wherever it takes place. We especially mourn the loss of any humanitarian workers. There must be, however, a reframing of the approach this Council and humanitarian agencies are taking. How did 9 Hamas terrorists find themselves traveling inside Red Crescent ambulances in the middle of the night? The presence of those terrorists puts everyone's lives at risk. If we really want to protect civilians and humanitarian workers, the vetting system of such organization must improve immediately. Otherwise, we will find more taxpayer money in the pockets of terrorists and more innocent lives in danger. As I have said, we are investigating all of those incidents, and we respect the work of UN personnel. However, this Council must acknowledge the infiltration of some agencies and their activities by bad actors. A prime example of the need for better vetting was discovered just 2 weeks ago. A UN worker was being treated in Israel, and something deeply disturbing was uncovered. This man had Nazi tattoos across both his arms. On one arm, as you can see, the man had the motto of the SS, a UN employee. On the other arm, the tattoo was the face of an SS soldier wearing a Nazi hat and a collar with Nazi symbols. It's hard to see, but that's what he had on both of his arms. Let me repeat. Underneath a shirt bearing the UN emblem were markings which glorified the Nazis. Who is approving these people? Who is conducting their interviews? The presence of such disgusting symbols on UN personnel should shock every member of this council. So let us be clear. When terrorists operate in active combat zones while using humanitarian vehicles as taxis, we will do whatever it takes to protect our soldiers and our citizens in accordance with our international obligations. That is the price of defending human life in a war Hamas started and refuses to end. Of course, this is not a one-off. It is part of Hamas's system. Just days ago, as some of you mentioned earlier, our forces carried out a precise strike on Hamas terrorists in Jabalia. These terrorists were hiding inside a command and control complex built inside an UNRWA clinic. This terror hub was used by Hamas's Jabalia battalion to plan and coordinate attacks against Israeli civilians and IDF forces. So what you do when you have a command center of terrorists, you attack them. Our strike was deliberate, intelligence-based operation. Prior to the strike, many steps were taken to reduce the chance of harming civilians, including aerial observation and additional intelligence verification. But the truth is, this council simply cannot relate to the complexity of the situation Israel faces. We are facing a terrorist organization that carried out the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, raping, murdering, and burning entire families alive. And today they continue to hold our people in tunnels, subjecting them to torture, starvation, and psychological torment. They promise to commit these atrocities again and again and again. Not only that, but Hamas's entire strategy depends on the Council reacting exactly as it is. They steal ATRACs. They launch rockets from hospitals and UN facilities. They mobilize in ambulances. Today, ask yourselves, how they go from one place to another? You can testify to that. Sometimes they force themselves, sometimes they infiltrate the organization, but they don't move with taxis, no Uber, no military. They use ambulances and UN vehicles. They exploit humanitarian infrastructure as a shield because they know this council will rush to blame Israel for responding. Hamas has studied the United Nations and built its war plan based on the UN's moral confusion. Once again, we are seeing this tactic play out. The UN didn't wait for an investigation for any of the incidents discussed today. It did not wait for verified evidence. It didn't check the facts. It rushed to the microphones to condemn Israel before knowing anything at all, while ignoring the terrorist organization using its resources for evil. There is no other country on earth subjected to this kind of treatment. So many of the actions and statements here are political theater. they are not out of concern for the well-being of Gazans. Because if that was truly the priority, we would be discussing the mass anti-Hamas protests taking place inside Gaza. In the past weeks, tens of thousands of Palestinians have taken to the streets, not to protest Israel, but to protest Hamas. In Jabalia, Rafah, Khan Yunis, Gaza City. Allow me to share with you the sounds filling the streets of Gaza over the past 48 hours. It will be in Arabic, so I welcome you to listen to the translator. In this audio, you can hear the incredible bravery of some Gazans, bravery which so many in this building are lacking. These brave people are chanting, Hamas itla bara, 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 bara. Hamas go out, 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 out. You can imagine how Hamas responded. Not with dialogue, not with reform, not by releasing our hostages and ending the war, but with public executions and torture. Uday al-Rubia, a 22-year-old from Gaza City, was kidnapped, beaten with iron rods, and dragged through the streets with a rope around his neck. What was his crime? Speaking out, organizing peaceful protests, demanding a future without Hamas. He was returned to his family moments before his death, broken and lifeless. Still, the mourners at Uday's funeral shouted in defiance against Hamas. Again, they shouted. Another brave young man, Hussam al-Majdalawi, was shot in the legs and abandoned in Nuseirat Square. Mr. Mansour, these two young men, Uday and Hussam, have shown more bravery than you ever have. You speak here every time. For years, you still cannot bring yourself to even mention Hamas, let alone condemn them. How many times you have spoken in this council, but you cannot mention Hamas, you cannot tell them the truth. I ask you here and now, can you show some of the bravery of those young demonstrators? Can you condemn Hamas? Can you say Hamas itla bara, 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 out, out, out? By your shameful silence, you stand with Hamas. By your shameful silence, you stand against the people of Gaza. By your shameful silence, you desecrate the UN Charter and its values. This Council and the entire UN has a choice to make. You can continue shielding Hamas under the cover of neutrality, or you can finally listen to the people of Gaza and support their cries for liberation from Hamas. You spoke about occupation of Gaza. I'm telling you here, and it's recorded, we have no intention to stay in Gaza. We left Gaza in 2005, completely. We didn't leave one community, not one soldier. We took out the cemeteries from Gaza. We left 20 years ago. We have no desire to go back. Distinguished colleagues, Israel will continue to defend its people. We will continue to take every measure possible to protect civilians and humanitarian workers, and we mourn every innocent life lost. However, we will never allow Hamas to rebuild under the false cover of human rights. Those days are long gone. We will not apologize for striking terrorist commanders. We will not hesitate to dismantle Hamas's terror machine, piece by piece, neighborhood by neighborhood, until the threat is gone. That is not our right. It is our obligation to our people, to our children, and to our future. Before I conclude, this war will not end on the UN's timeline. It will end when the 59 remaining hostages are released and Hamas is removed from power. There is no easy solution to a terrorist problem. There is no ceasefire agreement that can hold while innocent people remain in captivity. We are dealing with a vicious, sophisticated enemy with no red lines, no limits, no value for human life. We will do all that is necessary to defeat this dark force. We will act with determination until we bring back our hostages, every single one of them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Monsieur le représentant permanent
I
d'Israël
thank the
pour
permanent
sa
representative of
déclaration et
Israel
je
for
donne la
that
parole à
statement.
Monsieur
I
le
give the
représentant
floor
permanent de
to
la
the
Libye.
permanent representative of Libya.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President.
أتقدم بهذا البيان
I make this
باسم
statement
المجموعة
on behalf
العربية
of the Arab group
وأشكركم على
I would like to
تلبية
thank you
دعوة الجزائر الممثل العربي
for positively
المجلس
responding to
لعقد
the
هذا
call by
الاجتماع
Algeria to
الهام.
hold this important meeting.
كما أشكر
I
السيد
also would like to
فولكان
thank
ترك
Mr. Volker Turk
والدكتور يونس
and
الخطيب
Dr.
على
Yunus
إحاطتهما
Al-Khatib for
والتي
their
توضح
briefings
حجم المأساة
that
وتدهور
highlight the
الأوضاع
magnitude of
التي
the
فاقت
tragedy
جميع
and
المقاييس.
the deterioration that has exceeded
نتحدث إليكم
all
اليوم
measures.
وقد وصلت
Here,
الأزمة ذروتها
today we speak as the
حتى لم
crisis
يعد
has reached its
يجدي
peak,
إعداد البيانات واختيار
making
الكلمات
statements and selecting words
فأصبحنا
are
نتحدث
of
لكم
no use. We
بما
speak
نشعر
to
به
you
عن
and
ظهر
before
قلب.
you, speaking our
ولا
minds
داعي
and our
لإقناعكم
feelings. We don't need to
بحجم
convince you
الانتهاكات
of the
والمجازر التي
magnitude of
تقترف
violations
كل
and the
يوم
massacres
وعلى مدى أكثر من
committed every day
15
for more
شهرا
than
وحتى
15
الآن.
months and to date.
اليوم استمعتم إلى شهادة
Today we
الدكتور
have
الخطيب
listened to the testimony
من
by
قلب
Dr. Al-Khatib from the ground.
مجزرة أخرى
Another massacre
اقترفتها
that
قوات
was
الاحتلال
committed
الإسرائيلي
by the Israeli
بقتلها
occupation
وبدم
forces by
بارد.
killing in cold
وكما اعترفوا اليوم
blood. And as they have
قتلوا طواقم
admitted
للهلال
today, they
الأحمر
have killed teams for
والدفاع
the
المدني
Red Crescent
والأمم
and
المتحدة
civil defense and the UN
بحجة وجود
under the
مقاتلين
pretext
لحماس.
that there are Hamas fighters
مجزرة
among them.
اقترفت
A
بشكل
massacre that
متعمد
was committed deliberately,
وتم بعدها
and
تجريفهم
afterwards
تجريف الجثث
the bodies
ورميهم في مقبرة
were
جماعية
thrown in a mass grave
ومحاولة لطمس ما حدث.
in an attempt to obliterate and
جريمة
hide
أخرى
what was
تضاف
done. Another
لسلسلة
crime
الجرائم
added
ضد الطواقم
to a
الإنسانية
series of crimes against
والتي وفاق
humanitarian
ضحاياها حتى
workers
اليوم
which has
أكثر من
claimed more
600
than 600
من بينهم
humanitarians,
إعلاميين.
including media
عندما
personnel.
تسأل دكتور رياض
When
لماذا
you
لا
ask
يأتي
Dr.
إعلاميين من
Riyad,
دول أخرى
why don't we have
فبالتأكيد
journalists from other
سيتهموا
countries
بالانضمام
that
لحماس
come? Of course, they will be
وسيتم قتلهم.
accused of joining Hamas and they will be killed accordingly.
سمعنا اليوم
We have
دعوات
listened
لتحقيق
today to the
مستقل
calls
وشفاف لهذا
for
الموضوع
a transparent and
وسؤال
independent investigation
ماذا
into this
حدث
matter.
في
The
الدعوات
question,
السابقة
what happened to previous
لتحقيقات
calls
مثيلة
for
وأين هي
similar
نتائجها؟
investigations and
للأسف لا شيء
where are the
قتل.
results of those investigations? Unfortunately,
سيد الرئيس
nothing has been
إن
done.
هذه
Mr.
الشهادات هي
President,
عينة
these
من
testimonies
القصص
are but a sample
والأحداث
of
والحملة
stories,
الممنهجة
events,
التي
and
يتعرض
the
لها أهلنا
systematic
في غزة
campaign
والضفة
against our
الغربية
people in Gaza
ليس
and the
الآن
West
فقط
Bank, not just
ولكن منذ
now,
عقود
but for decades.
وما الحديث والتركيز فقط على ما يحدث في
And
غزة
focusing on just
ووضع
what's
كل
happening in
الأمور
Gaza
على حماس
and
السؤال
throwing all
دائما
the blame on
وماذا عن
Hamas,
الضفة الغربية
we ask
وما
about
كان
the
يحدث
West
فيها
Bank.
قبل 7 من أكتوبر
What about the events
إن هذه
in the
الحملة
West Bank
من
before
الحصار
October 7?
والتجويع
This campaign
وقصف
of
النازحين
blockade,
وحرق الأطفال
starvation,
والنساء
and the bombardment of
لدليل آخر على
women
نهج
and
الإبادة
children
الجماعية
is another evidence of
التي
the
يرتكبها جيش
approach
الاحتلال
and
دون
method
محاسبة
of genocide
وأمام
by the
المرأة
occupation
ومسمع
in full
الجميع
impunity as everyone
منقول لكم
listens
صوتا
and
وصورة
watches.
وبالنقل المباشر
Everything is being communicated
فماذا
live,
أنتم فاعلون؟
broadcast live. What would you
كان
do
آخر هذه
about it all?
الانتهاكات
The most recent of those
استباحة المسجد
violations
الأقصى يوم بالأمس
desecrating
من
Al-Aqsa
المدعو
Mosque yesterday
وزير الأمن
by
القومي
the
الإسرائيلي
so-called Minister of
محاولة
National
أخرى
Security of
لاستفزاز
Israel
الجميع.
in another attempt to
والمجموعة
provoke
العربية
everyone. And the
تدين
Arab
بأشد
group
العبارات
condemns in
هذه
the strongest
الاستفزازات
terms these
والتي لن تجدي نفعا
provocations,
إنما
and these
سيزيد الأمر
would not be of any
توترا.
avail. It will only
وعندها
increase
عندما
the
يحدث ردة
tension.
فعل
And
طبيعية
when there is a
سيتم
natural
اتهام
reaction
المفعول
to
به
this, those who
والنسيان
are the
من
victims
هو
will be
الفاعل.
accused, and people will forget who
إن المجموعة
perpetrated
العربية
such
عملت منذ
acts.
اليوم الأول
Their group,
للأحداث
since
على
the first day,
التواصل
has
مع
worked
جميع
to
الدول
work with all
ومع أعضاء
countries
المجلس.
and the members
كان
of the
آخرها
council,
التواصل
the
معك
most
سيد
recent
الرئيس
of which
يوم
was
أمس
communication with you,
وأول
Mr.
أمس
President,
ومع
yesterday or the day
المجموعة
before
العشرة
yesterday,
ولا
and
زالت
with
الجهود
the
قائمة في هذا
E10,
الإطار
and we are still
لإيجاد
working
حل
on this
ومخرج
track to
لهذه
find an
الأزمة
exit from this
وذلك
crisis
لنقل
and
حقائق
the solution
الأمور
so that we can
وإيجاد
relate
حلول
the
عملية
facts
لإيقاف هذه
and
المجازر
find practical
فورا.
solutions to end these
إن
massacres
المجموعة
immediately.
العربية ومن
The Arab
خلال
group
بيانات
and
القمة
through
العربية
the Arab
الأخيرة
summit
الغير
recent
اعتيادية التي قامت أو حدثت في القاهرة
statement in the extraordinary
أوضحت موقفها
summit
الواحد
held in
الموحد
Cairo, we have
ضد هذه
spoken in one
الانتهاكات
voice against these
وضرورة
violations
وقف
and
إطلاق النار
spoken
فورا
to the need
ومنع
for
أي
an
محاولة
immediate ceasefire and
للتهجير
ending
القسري
any attempt for
وضرورة
forced
إدخال المساعدات
displacement and the
الإنسانية
need to
فورا.
deliver humanitarian
هذا
aid
الموقف
immediately. This
ليس موقف
position
فقط المجموعة
is not
العربية
just the position of the
بل هي
Arab group,
المجموعة
it is the
الإسلامية
position of the
والعالم
Islamic group
الحر.
and the free world.
هذه الأفعال التي تقترف
These
وغيرها تضع هذا
actions
المجلس أمام
committed
مسؤولية
put this
تاريخية
council before a historic
ومع عجزها
responsibility,
عن إصدار
and with
أي
the
مخرجات
inability
وتفعيلها
to
سيكون وصمة
have
عار
any council
سيتذكرها
product
التاريخ
would be a
لعقود.
disgrace
لذا
that will
حان
be
الوقت
remembered by history for
للتحرك
decades. It is
فورا.
time to act
إن
now
المجموعة العربية
immediately.
دعمت
The Arab
اتفاق
group has
وقف إطلاق النار
supported the
الذي تم
ceasefire
التوصل
agreement that
إليه
was
بوساطة كل
reached
من مصر
by the mediation
وقطر
of Egypt,
والولايات
Qatar,
المتحدة.
and the United States.
هذا الاتفاق الذي
This
تفاءل به
agreement
الجميع
was
والذي
something
كان
that we all
يسير
found as an optimistic
بشكل
element,
جيد
and this
خلال
agreement
مرحلته
was being
الأولى
implemented
ولكنه
seamlessly in the
اصطدم
first phase. However, this
بخرق
agreement
واضح وتعنت من الجانب
was
الإسرائيلي
violated by
وكان
the
السبب وراء
intransigence
ذلك
of the
سياسياً
Israeli
من
side,
قبل
and the
حكومة
reason was
الاحتلال
political by
لضمان
the
استمرار
government
عدوانها
of occupation
غير
to
مكترثة
guarantee
بأي
its continued
محاولات
aggression,
دولية لإنهاء هذا الأمر.
riding roughshod over any attempts to end this.
لقد دعمت المجموعة
The Arab
العربية
group
اتفاق
has
وقف إطلاق النار
supported the
ورحبت أيضا
ceasefire agreement,
بجهود
and we have
الولايات
also
المتحدة
welcomed the effort of
والإدارة
the
الأمريكية
US and
الجديدة
the new
التي سعت
US
فعلا
administration
في
that
شهر يناير
has sought
بتطبيق
truly in
هذا
January
الأمر
to implement
والذي
this
نجح في البداية. فالسؤال
ceasefire, which
ماذا
was successful
تغير
at the beginning. The question is,
ولماذا
what
انتهى
went
هذا
differently
الموضوع؟
and why did this end?
نطلب من الإدارة
We ask
الأمريكية
the
أن
US
تواصل
administration to
المفاوضات مع
continue
كل من قطر
its
ومصر
negotiation with Qatar and
لتنفيذ
Egypt
بنود هذا
to
الاتفاق.
implement this agreement.
سيد الرئيس،
Mr. President,
في الختام
in
ترى
closing,
المجموعة
the
العربية
Arab group
أن تعمل أو يعمل مجلس الأمن
thinks
على
that
تحقيق
the Security
ودعم
Council needs to
النقاط
work
الثلاث
to
التالية.
support the following 3 points.
أولاً العمل على
First,
إصدار قرار
work
من
to
مجلس الأمن
adopt the
فوراً
Security Council resolution immediately that would
بإنهاء هذا العدوان
end this
والدعوة لوقف إطلاق
aggression
النار
and call for
شامل
a comprehensive
وكامل.
and full ceasefire.
أيضا
Further,
الدعوة لإدخال
call
المساعدات
for
الإنسانية
delivery
دون
of
توقف.
humanitarian aid without
وثالثا
interruption. 3.
استئناف المفاوضات
The
بخصوص
resumption
مراحل
of
الاتفاق الذي
negotiations
تم
on the
من
phases
أجل
of the
إنهاء ملف
agreement to
الرهائن
end the
والمحتجزين
dossier
والأسرى.
of those detained and the
ثانياً
hostages and
دعم
the prisoners.
مؤتمر الذي
Further support
ستعقده القاهرة الشهر
for
القادم
the
بشأن
conference
إعادة
by
إعمار
Cairo next
غزة
month on the reconstruction
والذي
of Gaza,
سيقام
which
بالتنسيق مع
will be
السلطة
held
الفلسطينية
in coordination
والأمم
with the
المتحدة.
Palestinian Authority and the United Nations.
ثالثاً
Third,
دعم المؤتمر
support
الذي
for
سيتم
the
عقده
conference that will
برئاسة
be
كل من
held
المملكة
under
السعودية
the chairmanship
وفرنسا
of
في
the
شهر
Kingdom
يونيو
of Saudi
القادم
Arabia and France
والخاص
next
بنقاش
June
موضوع
on
حل
the
الدولتين.
discussion on the two-state
سيدات السادة، ما
solution. Ladies
نعيشه
and
اليوم
gentlemen, what we are
ليس
living through
بأمر
today
يمكن السكوت عنه
is not
أكثر.
something that we can be silent
وأنتم أمام اختبار
vis-a-vis any
للتاريخ.
further. You are being tested by
فإما
history.
أن تصمدوا
Either
وتدعموا
you stand the test of
مبادئ
history and you
القانون
support
الدولي الإنساني
the